Hello, everyone. Takuya here.
And I'm Gabby.
And welcome back to the History of Everything podcast. Welcome back, my hoes. Okay, so we have had a very, very busy week with a lot of work that we have been doing at our house, in our house, around our house. And holy crap, has this put me behind on a number of things. But, even at the time that I'm recording this on Sunday morning, which is way later than what we normally would do, I'm still very excited to actually bring the story to you all. Gabby, how has this week been for you?
Fun.
Yeah, it's fun because you got all the projects that you wanted in the backyard done, finally, which, to be fair, is something that has had to be done.
And the flooring. You finally finished the flooring after 3 months?
Not after 3 months, Gabby. After like 5 months.
Yeah. And he still has one wall, but I'm going to count it as a win because we also painted like half of the downstairs. So we're getting all of this done and then we're going to sell this house. Unfortunate.
Eventually, yeah. Though we have said that every single year, and then every single year, either something ends up happening or you look at the market. Because for anyone who's seen my video that I did on the History of Everything podcast YouTube page, where it's like, why can no one buy a house? There's a reason why, many reasons why people just can't buy houses. It's a messy situation.
But we'd have to sell next year.
Yeah, we'd have to sell next year. But Gabby, do you know what else stops you from potentially being able to buy a house? When it gets burned down by the Mongols.
I mean, yeah, that'd do it. Does homeowners cover Mongol invasion?
No, it wouldn't. In fact, if anything, it might be closer to when you have insurance for like burglaries or other stuff. But no, if someone just goes and attacks and burns down your home, I don't think that, considering that the agency also probably got burned to the ground. The infrastructure also got destroyed. I'm pretty sure it's not just your house that specifically was targeted. I'm pretty sure everything in your local area is gone. Yeah. You may then ask yourself a question, getting into our story. What is one of the things that European conquerors have struggled with the most?
Invading Russia.
Yeah, that is correct. Invading Russia. That is absolutely true. Yeah, the amount of times that different conquerors, that's what creates the meme of like, don't invade Russia in winter. And it's a meme and also sound advice. That is a thing. Long before Napoleon had tried to fail and invade Russia, there was an empire in the East who had tried their luck in the harsh Russian climate. And for the most part, they succeeded. So when we talk about don't mess with the Mongols, in this case, we're going to be talking about the Mongol Invasion of Russia, which is a brutal story. And we're going to be getting into all this. But first, before we actually do that, we're going to need to establish some context, which is very important for this. I know that when I talked before about, I did a YouTube video that was on Mongol siege tactics. I remember that was one of the early ones that I did for the History of Everything page. And that was a fun one. That was at a time where they had actually developed the tactics, and going into this war with Russia, or the Rus in Russia, this is what we would be talking about, where they already have that. But we are not quite there yet. So, okay, the Mongols. The son of one Mongol chieftain had quickly risen in power after a series of conflicts between tribes. This individual, after uniting all of these tribes, would eventually give him the name Genghis Khan. Or I say Genghis, that's how we would have it in the more anglicized version. It's like closer to, in Mongolian, Chinggis Khan is actually how it was supposed to be. The end of these conflicts in 1206 is widely seen as the start of the Mongol Empire, the point in which, for the first time in history, the disparate Mongol tribesmen were actually united under one force and entity. And almost immediately after this would happen, Chinggis would start expanding his new empire into Central Asia and also towards Europe. Over the next 20 years, the Mongol Empire would span from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Caspian Sea, bordering Tibet in the south and Siberia in the north. Which, when I say this, okay, you know how I'm talking about Genghis Khan, the great conqueror? After he united Mongolia, both the original region and the idea of Greater Mongolia, he didn't really go as much further beyond that himself, because by the time that it gets to that point, the man is old. He is old and he is obese and he can't really do things anymore. So it's mostly his generals that are doing that.
So his generals were the one that expanded the empire as far as it reached?
Correct. He united it And then it was mostly his generals that actually went and expanded it. His generals, his sons, and other leaders within Mongol society. Yes.
Didn't he also have, was it multiple sons? So they all split the empire afterwards?
Correct. Yes, we are going to be getting into that because it creates the idea of, okay, so you have Genghis Khan, who was the overall Khan. He was the ruler. He was the great Khan. You get a number of Khanates, which is like a kingdom, but under different Khans that serve under the head Khan. Like that was the idea. Because you had the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, the Khanate of the Golden Horde, and then you had the Great Khan that was the East, because really that's all that mattered, where you had what eventually became the Yuan dynasty. Anyway, moving on from all of that, this is before all of this is kind of split. So the Mongol Empire would launch an initial campaign in the Southern Caucasus in 1223. This campaign of approximately 30,000 men would defeat the Georgians, who, funnily enough, at this time, they were supposed to be joining on the Fifth Crusade, because that was happening at this time, so it just created a whole bunch of chaos. They also defeated or went in against the Kievan Rus and the other steppe tribes of the region. Now, when I say defeated, they didn't conquer this necessarily. It was a raid. It was a raid without really gaining territory. It was the only excursion into Eastern Europe during Genghis Khan's lifetime, despite his later plans to actually conquer the region. In the end, he would die just a few years later in 1227, never actually fully reaching into Europe itself. This brings us then to the rise of Ogedei. So Genghis Khan's death would see his youngest serve as regent for the empire until Genghis's third son, Ogedei, would ascend to the throne 2 years later. Now, Ogedei was thrust into this position of power, and he immediately had a lot of issues to fix with the empire, namely the fact that they didn't really have money to actually pay people in the military, and there was no real state apparatus to rule over the conquered territory effectively. Think on it like this. The Mongols conquered everything so incredibly fast, and prior to the rise of Genghis Khan, there was no Mongolian state. That didn't exist. Genghis Khan basically built a system from scratch, brought it up, and then he died. In most cases, what ends up happening after the death of a great ruler or conqueror, what happens to the empire?
It splits apart.
It splits apart. It falls apart. There is nothing that actually maintains it. That is usually what ends up happening in history. And it sort of does here, but not really. The thing about this is that there's still a bunch of tribesmen who have not adopted the political, what's the terminology that I'm trying to use here? They didn't have the political know-how like the Chinese did for how to operate a state, you know? So this was a very confusing thing. And so to solve both problems in one fell swoop, he would establish the capital city of the Mongol Empire, Karakorum. In this, they were not going to have just a roving tent camp that went around their empire, which is how they actually operated at that time. From here, he would establish a bureaucracy to actually collect tax and oversee the state. Something that before they didn't have because it was a bunch of horsemen riding around all the time, burning everyone's shit down.
How did the bunch of horsemen react to being taxed for the first time?
Okay, so the thing is, very good question. Genghis at least had done a very good job building loyalty. Loyalty to himself, loyalty to his family, loyalty to the system upon which he built. And so the way that you did this is that he already had people that were loyal. And then if you went against him, or specifically against his heir, the person who was taking over, you died horribly, brutally. Like the system that he built was quite meritocratic, which meant that a lot of the old tribal systems that existed, because this is normally what would happen. The leader would die. There would be infighting between the varying different families who was going to take over for the next kind of Khanate. Things would end up splitting apart. It all kind of goes downhill from there. In his case, he destroyed that old system. He kept on promoting people based on their actual ability to do something versus who their father was.
Good.
Yeah, we say good because yes, that was a really good thing. And it meant that you didn't have these or nearly as many entrenched older nobility, aristocracy that could interfere with things in the state, so to speak. Anyway, he does this. He follows in his father's footsteps. He holds multiple campaigns, with the most notable being to further the campaigns in China and eventually go and take over that region. He retakes the Middle East, and he once more ventures into the Caucasus. Now, the campaign against the Jin state of China would end in 1234. And so with China, the great state conquered, he could turn his focus to the west. In 1235, his nephew Batu was elected the commander-in-chief of the western part of the Mongol Empire. Ogedei would then task Batu with the invasion of Europe. Now this is where we actually get into things. The Mongolian tactics for their invasion of Eastern Europe would end up being the same as it always had been. Send an envoy to the ruler of a territory, demand that they surrender and pay tribute. If the ruler submits to the demands, then the people were treated better, meaning that most of them actually survived. And if the ruler refused, can you guess what happened?
They would destroy the entire city and burn everyone, kill everyone.
Oh, literally, yes. This is where the whole thing for Mountains of Skulls end up coming into place. Yeah, the Mongols did not, they didn't really like it when people said no to them.
They gave them a choice.
Yeah, they did. But in most cases, the pride of others was way too stubborn. And it doesn't end well. Not at all. So, yeah, again, if the ruler submits, they survive. If they don't, well, they don't. Their holding would fall to the Mongols, and it would in turn devastate the population, the cities, the people would be slaughtered or enslaved, the cities burned, yada, yada, yada. You know, that old song and dance. That's kind of how it works.
Very Game of Thrones-esque.
Oh, yeah. With the whole, honestly, you really think about it. The Mongols could have actually created an Iron Throne. You know how in the whole thing in Game of Thrones, it's like the throne itself is made of the swords of places that were conquered?
Yes.
That's like, so the Mongols literally could do that. The amount of times that they conquered a state or some noble entity or literally anything, and they got family swords, wiped out entire dynasties, they could probably take all those swords and make an actual throne out of it. You could literally have a Mongolian throne of swords. That is actually a really cool idea. So, all right, the invasion of the Rus principalities. What is the one lesson that most historians talk about when it comes to invading Russia? Don't. Like, literally don't. Don't invade Russia in the winter. It's not going to end well. Well, what Batu and the Mongol army tried was exactly that. So Batu's invading army would cross the Volga River in December of 1237. You know how there's the whole thing where it's like, oh, hey, you don't want to start your campaign too or too late. You don't want to start in the fall. He literally invades Russia in the dead of winter when no one goes there. We're talking December of 1237.
Well, he was doing what no one expected, which is the smart thing to do.
Yeah, that's true. But okay, just for reference here, I'm gonna pull this up because I'm curious about this. Okay, Russia. Actually, let's look at Moscow. Let's look at Moscow weather, December average. What is it typically? Yes, the average temperature is a high of 27 degrees. With the average low being 19 degrees. That's the average. Of course, you can have a much colder time, and that's Moscow. If you're talking about invading further in on the steppes, like, it gets way colder. Way colder. Okay? Also, I'm talking about here the thing with the Volga River. Russia is a huge region, so I mean, it's going across all over the place. Anyway, he enters the first of the Russian principalities and begins besieging the city of Ryazan. The Russian prince of Ryazan did not accept. Instead, he requested help from Yuri II, who was the Grand Prince of Vladimir. But no help came. Here's the thing that you have to understand about this. There were many long-standing rivalries between the various Russian princes, meaning that even with this great threat at their doorstep, these guys did not work together whatsoever. And when I say principalities, here's what you all have to understand. Technically speaking, in Russia at this time, which was the Kievan Rus, there was a grand prince, but you could think of it as more of a loose, not even confederation, loose association of princes who ruled over their varying different territories. And while some of them might technically pay homage to a ruler, in actuality, they didn't listen to him whatsoever. Like, think of an even more disparate and larger system than when we talk about medieval France and how the King of France literally only ruled Paris and that's it. That's pretty much what it was like for the Grand Prince. He didn't control jack. And so all these different, basically independent states are having to pretty much fend for themselves. The Mongols very quickly took the city, leaving nothing but death and destruction in their wake. And that was just the beginning. Ogedei Khan would continue to sweep through the Kievan Rus. He would burn down Kolomna and Moscow within 6 weeks of Ryazan falling. 6 weeks. He is moving rapidly before reaching the capital of the Principality of Vladimir on February 4th, 1238. The forces of Vladimir, led by Yuri's sons, had tried to stop the advancing Mongol army, but it did not work. Their army was devastated. Yuri had long since fled the city, leaving in December of 1237 to try and seek help from his cousins in Novgorod and Rostov, leaving his sons in charge of the defense of the city. Even if his cousins came to his aid, it would not have arrived in time. The destruction of the city's army left it poorly defended, and in just 3 days, the city ended up falling, leaving Yuri the only surviving member of his direct family. The city was burned to the ground, its people slaughtered or enslaved. Upon hearing news of the siege, Yuri would ride with a small army to try and break the siege upon arriving a month too late, and they were surrounded and quickly overwhelmed. Yuri, along with his nephew, were both killed. From here, Ogedei Khan would divide his army, destroying 14 more Russian cities. Other cities, hearing about the destruction of these places, would in turn surrender, and they would agree to pay tribute, and they were spared. This was usually the tactics that the Mongols employed. Overwhelming destruction upon the initial states that refuse, because they can't go with that same kind of energy for the entire time, because then they're going to not have anything that they can get back to actually rule later. But in an initial invasion, if you make a few, what's the word that we're going to look for here? Examples out of the population, the rest of them begin to quickly fall in line. And so by utilizing this overwhelming brutality, you don't really have to worry about as much later. Among these was the city of Novgorod. By mid-1238, he had devastated Crimea and pacified further north. Then, in winter of 1239, Batu would continue his conquest, taking even more cities in what is today modern Ukraine. Kiev and its Grand Prince were regarded as the senior of the Rus principalities. But, like all the other Russian principalities, it suffered from rivalries that would leave the city weak and without allies. The Mongols at this time would send to Kiev envoys in order to be able to demand their surrender. These were executed. But when the then Grand Prince fled to Hungary, others would take the chance to take the city in November of 1240 under the control of the Principality of Galicia-Volhynia. Kiev would be the final resistance that the Russian princes had against the Mongols. Think about this. When we talk about this story, there are not many surviving accounts of the siege of Kiev, but from what historians could pull together, here's how this all played out. On November 28th, 1240, the Mongols started their siege of the city, setting up catapults and beginning their bombardment of the city walls. Remember that at this time that they are actually invading Europe, this is when the Mongols actually have more siege ability. In comparison to what things looked like 20 years prior, they have gone up against city after city after city and have learned the tactics for actually how to go against them. Just 9 days later, the walls fell. Mongol forces surged forward, taking much of the city. And as night fell, the Mongols would hold their positions. The citizens of Kiev would retreat into the center of the city. There was no hope for the remaining defenders. The battle was lost. Of the 50,000 inhabitants of the city that existed there on November 27th, do you know how many would last? How many would be left after 2 weeks?
No.
About 2,000. 48,000 people would be slaughtered at this time. We are talking about what was here 96% of the entire population. With the fall of Kiev, the remaining Rus principalities had no choice but to submit to Ogedei Khan, or else they would suffer the same fate. The Mongol invasion of Russia was over. In just 3 years, the Mongol Empire had managed to conquer Russia. Did they own every single city directly? No, because that's not how the Mongols operated. Remember that they went in, burned a bunch of shit to the ground, and everyone else swore their allegiance to them. As long as they paid their tribute, as long as they gave some men for future endeavors for different things, but mostly in this case, it was money, literally just money, they would be spared. They would be left. And they would be considered conquered. The door was thus open for the rest of Europe, and the Mongol armies would quickly sweep through into Poland and Hungary. However, the death of Ogedei in late 1241, that would bring the Mongol advance into Europe to a halt. Because in the aftermath of Ogedei's death, Ogedei Khan would establish the state of the Golden Horde in southern Russia, which would be ruled by his successors for the next 200 years. And that actually brings us to the conclusion of all of this, which brings us back in turn to the point that we even talked about at the very beginning. When you had the death of the Khan, what would typically happen, and this happened multiple times, where the Mongols literally were stopped from invading a territory because of the death of a ruler. Because the most interesting part about this is that even if there was a presumed heir, someone who was supposed to be taking over afterwards, do you know what happened when the Mongol Khan would die?
No.
The next one was elected. So what would happen is that you had all of these very big and important figures, these generals who were some of the most prestigious and politically connected, not even connected, politically useful. No, not useful. What is the term I'm trying to look? Influential, impactful. They were the people who were the ones that were largely making the choices of who was going to be the next ruler. And any one of them could be the next one. So all these generals are out in the field, conquering, burning, raiding, doing all this shit. They hear, oh, hey, the great Khan has died. What do? They all turn around and head home. So all these armies that are out conquering at different points, they then have to spend the next year or so, not maybe year, but like half a year, leaving the front line, traveling back with their army, getting back to Karakorum, and then once they are back at the city, then the next one amongst all of them get elected.
Interesting. Okay, so we covered them invading Russia and other parts of Europe. The tribute system, I think, would be a really fun episode to just dive into how they actually did their bureaucracy. Because how did the tributes work? Was it just distributed to the Khan for, as a tax? If he was getting all this money from tributes, did he need to heavily tax his people? There's a lot of fun little questions in there.
How did ancient taxes work? That's actually a great thing because tribute was part of tax.
Yeah, but not just ancient taxes, but just the specific Mongol way.
Specifically what they would do. I'll give you an example of one of the things that was done. The way that China would operate and what the Mongols did is that tribute were, for some of the states that saw themselves as more independent, it wasn't tribute, it was a gift. So it was a diplomatic gift that would be granted, and this could vary in amount. Sometimes the thing is you could give too little and it was seen as an insult. So it was typically better to be safer than sorry, because if you were going to be sorry in these circumstances, all of your shit was getting burnt to the ground and your entire family and maybe all of your people killed.
But did they ask for a specific amount in taxes?
So yes, and oftentimes they would ask for or demand specific goods from places. So money is, of course, the big thing that would often happen. Silver, gold, that sort of thing, of course. The other thing would be livestock, or in the case of China and other regions that had access to silk, you would have textiles. Over the course of history, actually, one of the biggest ways that people were able to trade or tax or do anything was literally in the form of textiles. It takes a long time to be able to produce cloth before the Industrial Revolution. So what would end up happening is that you would have bolts of cloth that would be given as tribute. And it would be some of the finest patterns, like all these varying things. And that would be something that would be done that would go towards the court.
Okay, so I found this like really interesting thing talking about under Ogedei and Monkey. I can't pronounce that. Monkey. Where their tax system, they changed it from just like, random numbers where you would just give a gift.
Yes.
To like a land tax based on the basis of the quantity and quality of the landowner's holdings, a poll tax on all adult males, which they had to pay in grain, a household tax, which was paid in silk, and various tolls and duties imposed on trade, commerce, and production of various commodities like salt. So they actually standardized it in like 1236.
Yes. See, because that was the whole thing with Karakorum that we were talking about before, where you actually developed the tax.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things to note, because you saw how a lot of those were goods. So this is a time in which money isn't nearly as common. Like, yes, money is there and people use coins in order to be able to represent things for currency and transaction and that sort of thing. But for many cases, if you owned a salt mine or something out of who knows where, right? You don't just have a whole bunch of money on hand necessarily to be able to do stuff until you take that to market. So oftentimes what would happen is that a percentage of the goods that you got were given to the state as tax. And salt was a great example of this because the state specifically always needed salt. They needed salt to be able to preserve foods for the army. You needed to be able to utilize it for the preservation within like state granaries and resources to be able to preserve foods for sieges or for famine or for other things. So salt was a thing that the state would directly take a cut of how much you produced as a form of tax.
Also, I think Ogedei also had a rule where you can only tax like 100 sheep was a taxable minimum. So you take one of 100 sheep or something. But don't quote me on that. Yep. I'm not a historian.
Yep. Livestock were very important. And that actually brings us in the end, when we talk about taxes, and I'm really glad you mentioned that, why their invasion of Russia was such a success. The thing about it is they moved very fast. They didn't focus on trying to take things over and just stay in one place. They were constantly moving. They were moving faster than other entities that could potentially try, even with utilizing scorched earth tactics against them, which was a very common thing in Russian history. The reason why it worked out for the Mongols is because they didn't have any supply trains. They didn't have any baggage. Everything that the Mongols needed, they carried with them. And in many cases, warriors would live off of diets of preserved meats along with horses' milk and blood. These were warriors who were extremely hardy. And because they kept all of their animals with them as they were moving, it meant that they had a constant supply of goods. Maybe not the highest quality goods, maybe not things that would last necessarily forever, but if other armies would run out of supplies in 2 weeks, the Mongols could go on for months without worries. And because of this, Russian winter never really slowed them down. You're also talking about entities that, let's say that you are used to much lighter climates. The steppe is not kind. When they came across from Siberia, effectively, to invade into Russia, They came from the harsher environment to invade into Russia. Therefore, they were already used to it. They had experience with it. They were literally the perfect entity to be able to invade. And considering that all of them were mounted, it just made it that much more effective. The thing about the Mongols that a lot of people get confused about is they think about these horsemen. Where are they getting more horses? Every single warrior had a spare mount. And in many cases, it was expected that you would have at least 2 to 3 spare mounts, with many warriors having 5. So you're talking about, let's say you have 30,000 men that you are invading with. You may have anywhere between 90 to 150,000 horses with you. That is insane. But that is precisely what would end up happening. They would be able to do this. And so when one would die, they move on. You have some of your herd. Guess what? You're running out of food. Slaughter some of the herd. Keep on going. It was a brutally effective method. And that's how they were able to do it. Anyway, my friends, that has been the invasion of Russia by the Mongols. Or I keep on using the term Russia. We know it is Russia today. It's the Kievan Rus, which is a very different thing entirely. The Kievan Rus are probably something that deserve their own episode in the future because it's literally Viking Russians. Like the Kievan Rus were founded by princes of like Viking raiders that went over into the east. And that's a fascinating story in and of itself. Either way, we are going to go ahead and end things here today. Thank you, my friends, for listening. I will see you all next time. Don't forget to check out Patreon. And if you want to go on any trips with us here in the future, be sure to check out the links in the description because we are obviously leading a trip here in winter ourselves as we're going to be going to the Christmas markets in Germany and Austria.
And there's limited spots available for that trip. So
exactly. So if you want to have some fun with us, you want to be able to go on an adventure and, drink instead of burning shit to the ground, join us. We will see you all next time. Goodbye, my friends.
Bye.